Some people walk past a stranger because they are busy, while others stop because their heart refuses to let them keep walking. And on one cold autumn afternoon in downtown Chicago, one simple decision would quietly change 3 lives forever. Gray clouds hung low above the city as a steady drizzle covered the sidewalks with shimmering reflections from traffic lights and storefront windows. Office workers hurried toward parking garages with umbrellas raised high. Delivery drivers rushed to complete their routes before the rain became heavier, and pedestrians lowered their heads against the chilly wind, each focused on reaching home before sunset. Near the corner of a busy intersection, an elderly woman carrying 2 small grocery bags attempted to step onto the curb when her foot slipped against the rain-soaked pavement. The bags fell from her hands. Oranges rolled across the sidewalk, and she slowly collapsed onto one knee before losing her balance completely. Several people looked in her direction. One man hesitated before checking his phone again and continuing forward. A young couple glanced briefly toward the fallen woman, but kept walking without slowing their pace. Others assumed someone else would stop. Within seconds, the crowd flowed around her as though she had become invisible. At that same moment, Ava Johnson stepped off a city bus wearing a neatly pressed navy housekeeping uniform beneath a simple raincoat. She had just finished a long shift cleaning one of Chicago's most luxurious private estates, and still carried a reusable grocery bag filled with discounted food she planned to take home for her father. Her paycheck barely covered rent, utilities, groceries, and medication, yet she had never allowed hardship to harden her heart. The moment she noticed the elderly woman struggling to sit up alone, she immediately placed her own bag beneath a nearby awning and hurried through the rain without the slightest hesitation. Kneeling carefully beside the stranger, Ava offered a warm smile instead of questions. "Please stay still for a moment," she said softly. "Let me make sure you are all right." The elderly woman looked embarrassed more than injured. Rainwater had dampened her elegant gray coat, and one hand trembled slightly as Ava helped gather the scattered groceries before gently supporting her to a nearby bench. Ava removed a clean handkerchief from her pocket and carefully wiped the moisture from the woman's hands before offering her own umbrella. "You should keep this," the older woman insisted with quiet gratitude. Ava smiled and gently shook her head. "You need it more than I do." She called for medical assistance, then remained seated beside the woman despite the growing rain, speaking calmly about ordinary things that eased the stranger's worry while waiting for help to arrive. The elderly woman noticed the kindness in Ava's eyes and asked why she had stopped when everyone else continued walking. Ava looked toward the crowded sidewalk before answering with peaceful sincerity. "My mother always told me that if someone is alone on the ground, they should never have to wonder whether another person will stop." The elderly woman's eyes quietly filled with emotion as she reached for Ava's hand. Before either of them realized that destiny had already begun moving around them, a convoy of sleek black sport utility vehicles slowly turned the corner, their headlights reflecting across the rain-covered street as they came to an orderly stop only a few yards away. The sleek black sport utility vehicles came to a smooth stop along the curb, their polished surfaces reflecting the falling rain, while several professionally dressed men stepped out with visible concern and immediately hurried toward the elderly woman sitting quietly beside Ava Johnson. None of them spoke loudly or caused a scene. Their movements were calm, disciplined, and respectful, but the urgency in their faces revealed that the woman they had been searching for was far more important than anyone standing nearby could have imagined. One of the men carefully knelt beside her and asked in a gentle voice whether she had been hurt. The elderly woman smiled reassuringly before pointing toward Ava. "I am perfectly safe because this young woman refused to leave me alone." Every pair of eyes slowly turned toward Ava. She suddenly realized that the stranger she had helped was surrounded by people who treated her with extraordinary care, yet she never allowed curiosity to replace courtesy. She simply stepped back and offered a quiet smile. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived, and paramedics completed a careful examination before recommending that the elderly woman visit St. Andrew Medical Center for additional observation. Although she appeared to have suffered only minor bruises, they wanted to ensure there were no hidden injuries. As the medical team prepared the stretcher, the elderly woman reached for Ava's hand once again. "Would you stay with me until we arrive?" she asked softly. Ava glanced toward the city bus she had planned to catch home, and then looked back into the older woman's hopeful eyes. Without hesitation, she nodded. Of course. The ride to the hospital was peaceful. Rain continued tapping gently against the ambulance windows while the elderly woman watched Ava with quiet admiration. She finally broke the silence with a warm smile. Most people today seem to have somewhere more important to be. Ava smiled gently without looking for praise. Everyone carries responsibilities. Sometimes people simply do not notice someone else needs help. The elderly woman tilted her head thoughtfully. And you noticed? Ava looked down at her folded hands before answering. My parents raised me to believe that kindness loses its meaning if it depends on who is receiving it. Those simple words settled into the quiet space between them. After arriving at the hospital, doctors confirmed that the elderly woman had escaped serious injury and only needed several routine examinations before returning home. Ava remained seated in the waiting area while nurses completed their work, refusing every offer of coffee, food, or reimbursement from the well-dressed assistants who had accompanied the older woman. Nearly an hour later, the elderly woman walked back into the waiting room carrying a warm blanket around her shoulders. She slowly approached Ava and removed a small envelope from her handbag. Please accept this, she said. You gave up your evening to care for a complete stranger. Ava politely pushed the envelope back into the woman's hands. I cannot accept money for doing what any decent person should do. The older woman's eyes softened with genuine affection. Then allow me to thank you another way. My name is Eleanor. Ava introduced herself with the same quiet sincerity. They spoke for another several minutes about family, ordinary life, and favorite neighborhood bakeries, never discussing wealth or influence. Before leaving, Eleanor gently squeezed Ava's hand and said, I hope our paths cross again. Ava smiled warmly, unaware that the promise carried far more meaning than either of them could yet understand. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she never noticed a tall man standing silently near the far end of the hospital corridor, watching the security camera footage with complete attention as every frame replayed the kindness of a woman he had never met. Long before a person reveals their true character with words, they reveal it through the quiet choices they believe no one will ever notice. As Ava Johnson disappeared into the evening crowd outside St. Andrew Medical Center, Vincent Romano remained standing in the hospital security office without saying a single word. The room was filled with glowing surveillance monitors, each replaying a different angle of the rainy afternoon that had brought his mother safely through an unexpected accident. He watched strangers hurry past without slowing down. He watched umbrellas move around the elderly woman as though she were nothing more than another obstacle on the sidewalk. Then the recording reached the moment when Ava entered the frame carrying a simple, reusable grocery bag beneath her raincoat. Vincent leaned slightly closer to the screen. She never looked around to see whether anyone was watching. She never hesitated before kneeling beside his mother. She never asked whether the older woman could repay her kindness. Every action appeared completely natural, as though helping another person required no discussion at all. The footage continued showing Ava gathering scattered groceries, offering her umbrella, remaining beside Eleanor throughout the rain, and accompanying her to the hospital without the slightest expectation of recognition. When the video ended, Vincent quietly asked the hospital security supervisor to replay it once more. Then again, the supervisor finally smiled politely and said, She seems like one of those rare people who simply does the right thing. Vincent nodded almost absent-mindedly. Yes, he answered softly. She does. A short time later, he entered his mother's hospital room where Eleanor rested comfortably beside the window, a warm blanket across her lap, and a book lying unopened beside her. The moment she saw her son, she smiled with the calm affection only a mother could offer. Vincent sat beside her and asked how she was feeling. Eleanor assured him she was perfectly fine before speaking about only one subject. Ava. She described the young woman with admiration rather than excitement, explaining how respectful she had been, how gently she had spoken, and how firmly she had refused every attempt to accept money. Eleanor laughed quietly as she recalled Ava insisting that kindness should never carry a price tag. Vincent listened carefully without interrupting. Finally he asked, Did she know who you were? Eleanor immediately shook her head. No. She believed I was simply another grandmother who needed help. The answer settled deeply inside him. Throughout his life, Vincent had met countless people who became noticeably kinder after learning his family name. Business associates suddenly became generous. Strangers offered compliments too quickly. Even charitable gestures sometimes carried invisible expectations. Yet this woman had shown extraordinary compassion before knowing anything at all. As evening settled across Chicago, Vincent returned to his office overlooking the illuminated skyline. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass, while traffic moved like streams of light far below. He placed his mother's medical report on the desk, but found himself thinking only about Ava's quiet smile and the words she had spoken inside the ambulance. Kindness loses its meaning if it depends on who is receiving it. Those words echoed through his thoughts with surprising force. He pressed the intercom button and calmly asked his executive assistant to arrange one simple task for the following morning. "I would like to know more about Ava Johnson," he said. "Not because I doubt her, because I want to understand how someone like her still exists." As the lights of the city shimmered beneath the darkening sky, Vincent had no idea that his search for answers was about to challenge everything he believed success had ever taught him. A person's daily life often reveals far more truth than any introduction ever could, and over the next several days, Vincent Romano quietly discovered that the woman who had helped his mother lived a life of remarkable simplicity hidden beneath ordinary routines. He had instructed his executive assistant to gather only publicly available information, making it clear that he wanted no intrusion into Ava Johnson's privacy and no interference with her life. He was not searching for secrets. He was searching for understanding. The report that arrived on his desk contained almost nothing extraordinary. Ava rented a modest apartment on the north side of Chicago. She worked full-time as a housekeeper for a respected cleaning service that maintained several upscale residences throughout the city. She had no expensive possessions, no history of legal trouble, no public recognition, and no social media presence filled with carefully crafted images. On paper, she appeared to be one more hard-working resident trying to build an honest life. Yet Vincent found himself unsatisfied with paperwork alone. One crisp morning, while dressed in an ordinary dark overcoat instead of one of his tailored business suits, he quietly observed from a respectful distance as Ava stepped off a city bus carrying a reusable lunch bag and a worn paperback novel. She greeted the bus driver with a cheerful smile before thanking him for waiting an extra moment for an elderly passenger who walked slowly with a cane. Outside the station, she paused to hold the door open for a mother pushing a stroller, then continued toward work without expecting so much as a thank you. Every gesture seemed effortless, as though consideration for others had become as natural as breathing. Later that afternoon, after finishing a demanding shift, Ava stopped at a neighborhood grocery store instead of heading directly home. She carefully compared prices, selected discounted vegetables, fresh bread, and a carton of milk before using several coupons folded neatly inside her wallet. There was no sign of embarrassment in the way she managed every dollar. Instead, there was quiet discipline and gratitude. From there, she walked several blocks to a modest brick apartment building where an older man waited near the front window. The moment Ava entered, his tired expression brightened. Vincent watched only long enough to see her embrace the man warmly before carrying the grocery bags inside. He asked his assistant one simple question. "Her father?" The answer came quietly. "Yes, Robert Johnson, retired city maintenance worker. Limited mobility after several health complications." Vincent remained silent as the pieces slowly came together. Every evening after work, Ava returned home not to rest but to prepare meals, organize medications, help with household chores, and spend time with the father who had once spent decades supporting his own family. The following morning, Vincent happened to pass another of the estates maintained by Ava's cleaning company. Through large front windows, he noticed her carefully helping one of the homeowners carry several heavy boxes from the front porch into the foyer. She smiled politely, accepted nothing more than a sincere thank you, and returned to her work without drawing attention to herself. It became increasingly difficult for Vincent to understand how someone carrying so many responsibilities could still find enough kindness to give freely to complete strangers. Late that evening, he visited his mother, who immediately noticed the thoughtful silence in her son's expression. Before he could speak, Eleanor smiled knowingly and asked, "You have been thinking about her, have you not?" Vincent looked toward the city lights beyond the window before answering honestly. Every day I learn something new about her, and every day I realize how little I truly understood about strength. Eleanor's gentle smile grew warmer as she quietly reached for his hand, already knowing that the greatest change taking place was not in Ava's life, but in her son's heart. The greatest truths often appear in the smallest moments, and as the days quietly passed, Vincent Romano found himself paying less attention to financial reports and business meetings than to the quiet rhythm of a woman whose life seemed to revolve around serving others without ever expecting recognition. One Saturday morning, while the city slowly awakened beneath clear blue skies, he chose to drive through Ava Johnson's neighborhood alone, leaving behind the security convoy that usually followed him everywhere. He parked several blocks away, determined only to observe from a respectful distance before returning to his own responsibilities. What he witnessed over the next few hours stayed with him far longer than he expected. Ava began her morning by helping her father, Robert Johnson, onto the small front porch so he could enjoy the fresh autumn air with a cup of coffee. She wrapped a light blanket around his shoulders, even though she had forgotten to bring one for herself. After making sure he was comfortable, she noticed an elderly neighbor struggling to carry several bags of groceries across the sidewalk. Without hesitation, Ava crossed the street, greeted the woman with genuine warmth, and carried every bag upstairs before returning home with the same quiet smile she always seemed to wear. There were no cameras, no audience, and no opportunity for praise. She behaved exactly as she had the rainy afternoon she met Eleanor, because kindness had become part of her identity rather than an occasional decision. Later that afternoon, Ava walked with her father to a nearby community park, moving slowly enough to match his careful steps. They shared a simple picnic consisting of homemade sandwiches, sliced apples, and lemonade poured into reusable cups. Robert laughed often, and Ava listened to every story as though she had never heard it before, even though Vincent suspected she knew every memory by heart. Watching them together reminded him of childhood afternoons he had almost forgotten, before responsibility and power had filled every hour of his life. When Ava excused herself for a few minutes, Robert remained seated beneath a large maple tree. An older gentleman occupying the neighboring bench struck up a friendly conversation, asking whether Ava was his daughter. Robert's face immediately brightened with unmistakable pride. She could have accepted better jobs in other states years ago, he said with a grateful smile. She stayed because she said families should never feel abandoned when they need each other most. Vincent quietly lowered his eyes. No report had mentioned opportunities she had willingly left behind. No document could measure the value of choices made out of love instead of ambition. As evening approached, he returned to Eleanor's home for dinner. His mother immediately noticed that something within him had shifted again. While tea gently steamed between them, Vincent shared everything he had observed. Eleanor listened patiently before speaking with calm certainty. Character is revealed when no reward is expected, she said. That young woman has already shown you who she is. The question now is whether you will allow yourself to learn from her. Vincent remained silent for several long moments, reflecting on every quiet act of compassion he had witnessed. Finally, he looked toward his mother and spoke with complete honesty. I have spent years believing strength meant protecting what belongs to me. She has shown me that true strength may simply be giving without keeping score. Eleanor smiled gently before reaching into her handbag and removing a small handwritten note. Then perhaps it is time for you to meet her properly, she said. I invited Ava to dinner next Thursday. She almost declined because she said she had an evening cleaning shift, but I asked one more time. Vincent looked at the note resting on the table between them, unaware that one shared meal would soon bring two completely different worlds together beneath the same roof. Thursday evening arrived with a cool breeze sweeping through Chicago as Ava Johnson stood outside an elegant wrought iron gate, holding a small paper bag containing a fresh loaf of bread from her favorite neighborhood bakery. She had insisted on bringing a simple gift despite Eleanor's repeated assurance that nothing was necessary. After finishing her daytime cleaning shift and arranging for a trusted neighbor to spend the evening with her father, Ava had almost called to cancel the invitation, believing she did not belong in the home of someone whose quiet grace hinted at a life far beyond her own. Yet Eleanor's warm voice on the telephone had echoed in her thoughts all afternoon. Please come. I would truly enjoy your company. Those words had been impossible to refuse. A member of the household staff welcomed Ava through the front entrance with genuine courtesy, taking her raincoat before guiding her through a grand foyer illuminated by soft golden chandeliers. Marble floors reflected the warm light, while family photographs lined the walls instead of expensive artwork alone, giving the remarkable residence an unexpected sense of comfort. Ava admired the beauty around her without envy, appreciating the craftsmanship while remaining perfectly at ease. As they approached the dining room, she noticed several familiar security vehicles parked beyond the front windows. A quiet feeling of recognition settled over her, although she could not yet understand why. Then the dining room doors slowly opened. Eleanor stood smiling beside a beautifully prepared table, her eyes bright with sincere happiness. Beside her stood a tall man wearing a tailored charcoal suit, whose calm expression immediately caught Ava's attention. For one brief moment, the room became perfectly still. Ava recognized him at once as the man she had glimpsed outside the hospital several days earlier. Vincent Romano recognized the same look of surprise crossing her face. Eleanor stepped forward before either of them could speak. "Ava," she said warmly, "there is someone I have wanted you to meet." She gently placed one hand on Vincent's arm. "This is my son, Vincent." Ava looked from Eleanor to Vincent and then toward the security vehicles visible through the distant windows. Every piece suddenly fit together with quiet clarity. She understood why so many people had rushed to the hospital, why everyone had treated Eleanor with extraordinary respect, and why Vincent had seemed so familiar. Yet instead of appearing intimidated, she simply smiled politely and extended her hand. "It is nice to meet you properly, Mr. Romano." Vincent accepted the handshake with genuine respect. "The pleasure is mine, Miss Johnson. I have been hoping for the opportunity to thank you in person." Ava shook her head gently. "There is no need. Your mother would have done the same for anyone else." Eleanor laughed softly. "That is exactly what I told him you would say." The three of them took their seats as the evening sun cast a warm amber glow across the dining room windows. Conversation flowed naturally from family memories to favorite meals, neighborhood traditions, and the changing colors of Chicago in autumn. At no point did Vincent mention business, wealth, or influence. Instead, he listened carefully each time Ava spoke, discovering that her quiet confidence came not from privilege but from unwavering principles. As dinner came to an end, Eleanor looked at both of them with unmistakable satisfaction, sensing something neither of them had fully realized. One unexpected act of kindness had already erased the invisible distance between two completely different worlds, and before the evening was over, the most important conversation had yet to begin. The most meaningful conversations are rarely planned, and as the dinner plates were quietly cleared from the table, a comfortable silence settled over the room that invited honesty instead of formality. Eleanor Romano poured fresh tea into 3 delicate cups before looking affectionately at Ava Johnson with the same gratitude that had filled her heart since the rainy afternoon when a complete stranger chose compassion over convenience. She smiled warmly and finally asked the question that had remained in her thoughts for days. "Ava, may I ask you something?" Ava nodded gently. "Of course." Eleanor folded her hands together and said, "When you saw me on that sidewalk, you did not know my name, my family, or anything about my life. You could have continued walking just as everyone else did. What made you stop?" Ava lowered her eyes for a brief moment before answering with complete sincerity. "Because you looked alone." The simplicity of the answer filled the room with quiet reflection. She continued softly, "When my mother was alive, she always reminded me that every person carries a story we cannot see. She believed that the smallest act of kindness could become the most important moment in someone else's day. After she passed away, I promised myself I would never become too busy to notice another human being." Eleanor's eyes shimmered with emotion. She reached across the table and gently placed her hand over Ava's. "She raised you beautifully." Vincent remained silent, listening more carefully than he had listened during any business negotiation in years. After several thoughtful moments, he finally spoke. "I owe you an apology." Ava looked up with quiet surprise. Vincent met her eyes without hesitation. "When I first learned that you had stayed with my mother at the hospital, I assumed there had to be a reason beyond kindness. I have spent so much of my life surrounded by people who expected something in return that I forgot genuine generosity could still exist without conditions. I did not judge you publicly, but in my own mind I questioned your motives, and for that I am sincerely sorry." Ava smiled with remarkable calm. "You do not need to apologize for being careful. Life teaches different lessons to different people." Vincent slowly shook his head. "Perhaps, but life also teaches us when we have been wrong." Eleanor watched her son with unmistakable pride. It had been years since she had heard him admit a mistake with such humility. The conversation continued late into the evening, moving effortlessly from childhood memories to favorite family traditions and the quiet values that had shaped each of them. Ava spoke fondly of her father and the sacrifices he had made throughout his working years. Vincent listened with growing admiration, realizing that the strongest people often live the simplest lives. Before the evening came to an end, he stood and walked toward a nearby window overlooking the illuminated gardens. Without turning around, he spoke in a thoughtful voice. "There are many employees in the companies connected to my family. Some struggle with responsibilities that others never notice. I have spent years measuring success through numbers and accomplishments. Tonight, I realize there is another measure that matters far more." He turned back toward Ava and Eleanor with a quiet smile that carried none of his usual reserve. "I believe it is time to build something that reflects the kind of compassion my mother received that day." Ava looked at him with curiosity, unaware that the idea forming in Vincent's heart would soon reach far beyond one family, one dinner, or one unexpected meeting in the rain. The weeks that followed proved that sincere gratitude is not measured by the size of a gift, but by the willingness to change because of what another person has taught you. Vincent Romano returned to his office with a renewed sense of purpose that surprised even those who had worked beside him for decades. Instead of beginning each morning with financial projections and investment reports, he spent time meeting with department leaders, human resources specialists, and community advisors. He wanted to understand the unseen burdens carried by the people whose daily efforts kept countless businesses operating. Quietly and without public announcements, he created a new employee assistance program dedicated to helping workers facing unexpected medical expenses, family caregiving responsibilities, and temporary financial hardship. When his executive team suggested naming the initiative after the Romano family, Vincent declined immediately. "This is not about our name," he said calmly. "It is about remembering why compassion matters." A few days later, he invited Ava Johnson to his office, not as an employee seeking instructions, but as someone whose judgment he genuinely respected. The office overlooked the Chicago skyline, yet Ava paid little attention to the breathtaking view. She remained the same humble woman who had once waited patiently beside a stranger in the rain. Vincent explained every detail of the new program before asking one final question. "Would you consider helping us shape this into something people can truly trust?" Ava listened thoughtfully before answering. "I appreciate the invitation, but I have never managed an organization like this." Vincent smiled gently. "Experience can be learned. Character cannot." Ava remained quiet for a long moment before speaking with her usual honesty. "If this program is meant to help people keep their dignity during difficult seasons, then I would be honored to contribute in whatever way I can." Together, they spent several afternoons discussing practical ideas rather than impressive promises. Ava suggested confidential application procedures so employees would never feel embarrassed asking for assistance. She recommended flexible schedules for family caregivers and partnerships with local organizations that already served older adults and working families. Every suggestion reflected the same principle that had guided her life from the beginning. Help should restore dignity, never replace it. As the months passed, the program quietly transformed hundreds of lives. Employees who had once struggled alone discovered that asking for temporary support no longer carried shame. Supervisors began noticing stronger teamwork, greater trust, and a workplace where compassion became part of everyday culture instead of an occasional gesture. Eleanor Romano watched these changes with deep satisfaction, knowing that none of them had begun inside a boardroom. They had begun on a rain-soaked sidewalk where one woman refused to ignore another person's pain. One afternoon, Vincent invited Ava and Robert Johnson to lunch at the estate gardens. As they walked beneath rows of colorful autumn trees, he presented Ava with a carefully prepared envelope. Inside was a generous financial gift intended to thank her for everything she had inspired. Ava read the letter quietly before closing the envelope and handing it back with a warm smile. "Your generosity means more than you know," she said softly, "but I cannot accept this." Vincent looked at her with surprise. "You earned it." Ava gently shook her head. "I never helped your mother because of who she was, and I cannot allow that moment to become something I did for money. If you truly wish to honor what happened that day, continue helping people who believe no one notices them." Robert smiled proudly at his daughter, while Eleanor's eyes filled with quiet emotion. Vincent slowly placed the unopened envelope back into his jacket, realizing that once again Ava had given him something far more valuable than anything he had attempted to give her in return. Nearly 1 year later, the rain returned to Chicago with the same quiet rhythm that had begun an unexpected chain of events. But this time the city felt different in ways that could not be measured on a balance sheet or announced in a press conference. The Employee Assistance Program Vincent Romano had established continued growing, helping families through medical emergencies, supporting caregivers, and reminding countless hard-working people that asking for help did not diminish their dignity. Ava Johnson never accepted public recognition for the role she had played in shaping the program. She continued working with the same humility that had always defined her, offering practical advice, listening carefully to those facing difficult seasons, and reminding every person she met that compassion should never make anyone feel indebted. Robert Johnson's health remained stable, and although he still moved carefully with the assistance of a cane, he often smiled as he watched his daughter leave for work each morning. He had always believed she possessed an extraordinary heart, but now he could see that her kindness had quietly inspired others to become better versions of themselves. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ava and Eleanor Romano decided to walk together through the same neighborhood where they had first met. Leaves drifted gently across the sidewalks while families enjoyed the cool weather in nearby parks. Neither woman spoke very much because neither felt the need to fill the comfortable silence. As they approached the familiar intersection, they noticed an elderly gentleman standing uncertainly beside the curb after dropping a small paper bag filled with groceries. Before Ava could take a single step forward, a young grocery store employee hurried across the street, gathered every item, helped the man onto a nearby bench, and asked whether he would like a bottle of water while waiting for transportation. The young employee never looked around for applause. He simply smiled and stayed beside the older man until everything was arranged. Ava and Eleanor exchanged a quiet glance before smiling at one another. Compassion had begun spreading from one person to another without anyone realizing where it had started. A short distance away, Vincent watched the scene from across the street after arriving to meet his mother and Ava for lunch. He remained exactly where he was, allowing the young employee to finish helping before walking over. As the three of them continued toward a nearby cafe, Vincent looked thoughtfully at the crowded sidewalk where strangers now seemed just a little more willing to notice one another. "I spent years believing influence came from power," he said softly. "Now I understand that influence begins with example." Eleanor gently slipped her arm through her son's and smiled with unmistakable pride. Ava simply looked ahead, appreciating the ordinary beauty of the afternoon without seeking credit for anything that had changed. She knew that genuine kindness rarely announced itself. It simply invited someone else to do the same. As the golden light of the setting sun stretched across the city streets, the three of them continued walking side by side, no longer separated by wealth, status, or circumstance, but united by a single moment when one person chose to stop instead of walking away. Long after names are forgotten and fortunes change, people remember how they were treated when they needed someone most. And on that quiet Chicago afternoon, the world remembered that dignity does not belong to the powerful alone. It belongs to every human heart willing to protect it in another.